So good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Taina Bien-Aimé, and I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. It's an honor to join Sanctuary for Families, which is the host of this event today. And so my co-moderator, Genoveva Eguiguren from Sanctuary for Families will join me in welcoming extraordinary advocates, frontline service providers, women's rights advocates who are working around the world to promote the rights of women and girls and provide them services, in particular, to help victims and survivors of many challenges that we are about to discuss. So the name of this panel is Mitigating the Risk of Disaster for Gender Violence Survivors. It is in commemoration of the Commission on the Status of Women, or CSW66, whose theme this year is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental disasters, and risk reduction. We were hoping that Jean DeCuna, the Senior Global Advisor on International Migration at UN Women, could join us. If she does join us, she is based in Egypt, so there may be some internet issues. So forgive us in advance for interrupting our wonderful conversation. We will interrupt to give her the floor for introductory remarks. Just a few logistical points. By now, we all know how Zoom works, but just to reiterate, so at the bottom of your screen, you will see a ribbon with different options. There's a Q&A bubble. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put in your questions. We will start the conversation then. And so I have the privilege of asking my first question to three extraordinary, outstanding advocates who collectively have probably 50 to 100 years of experience working at the front lines. Jean Enriquez, the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Asia Pacific, whose bio is way too long for me to share right now, but Jean is an extraordinary force in the Philippines and the Asia Pacific region and globally. Beatrice Dalencour-Turnier, who is the founder of KasiK Haiti, who is actually joining us from Haiti, just as Jean is joining us from the Philippines, will also talk to us about her work and how she provides medical, psychological, and other socio-cultural and economic services to victims. And last but not least in my group is Sheri Lochridge Combs, who is the Human Trafficking Program Manager of Covenant House in New Orleans, Louisiana. So welcome. And Genoveva, I don't know if you want to introduce yours or you want me to just go first.
Thank you, Taina, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Just very briefly, for participants who are joining us tonight, you can use the Q&A option on Zoom if you want to ask questions to the panelists, and we will have some time towards the end of this panel to address your questions. Thank you, Taina.
Thank you. So we are now in a very dire situation in so many parts of the world. We are facing just myriad crises, whether they are environmental crises from rapid climate change. There is a war going on in the Ukraine, conflict in Haiti. Each of you represents regions and cities that have been severely impacted by a number of man-made and natural disasters. And with that comes acute vulnerabilities, particularly vulnerabilities that affect women and girls. And so my first question to you is, you're each leaders in the anti-violence field. You work to combat human trafficking and other forms of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation. We cannot also forget the severe and ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are you each seeing on the ground? And your work was challenging before COVID-19. How are you addressing these compounded crises, and how has that affected the women and girls that you serve? And we'll start with Jean. Thank you.
Good evening to most of you. Thank you, Taina, for the question. And good morning from the Philippines. I would like to share a couple of photos from the Philippines. The Philippines is like the canary in the mine. We have been, what we have been suffering is actually foretelling of what others might suffer because of the climate crisis. And in the last decade, we have seen the worst typhoons, one of which has claimed 10,000 lives at least in 2013. That's Typhoon Haiyan. And just before Christmas last year, we were met by Typhoon Rai. And as Taina mentioned, that's on top of suffering from the lockdowns caused also by the pandemic, which has spelled the loss of livelihood for many women, especially, and made them even more vulnerable to sex trafficking. So following Typhoon Rai, let me just show this. She's a survivor of sexual exploitation. We have seen a lot of women losing not only their homes, but also their livelihood. But she in particular refused to go to the evacuation camp because her abusers among police officers might see her. So that's also one particular difficulty in getting assistance in the face of a very dire situation. So you can see the trees behind her sister and also their children severely damaged. Sources of livelihood, such as fishing and even informal work, because some of the women also drive this tricycle, were also severely damaged. A lot of the young people we assisted had to travel, young women we assisted had to travel far because the rice mills were destroyed in their particular towns, putting them also at greater risk. So an entire province was considered ground zero following Typhoon Rai. 18 towns and cities severely suffered damage. At least 150 survivors of sexual exploitation reported that their houses were severely inundated. And also, other than losing sources of livelihood, as I've mentioned, a lot of them find it very difficult to be able to get assistance. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, police officers who were the ones mobile during lockdowns took advantage also of the situation. One of the women we had to assist were approached by the police asking for sex in exchange for a loaf of bread. So she, of course, was left with no choice. And often the women, not only she, but other women were fetched from their houses by police officers to be brought to hotels or their condominiums to be sexually abused. So these are what have to be suffered by the women doubly, and how they were particularly targeted also as women during crises such as the COVID-19, other than severe typhoon. Many of the women also were enticed to go back to the sex industry because of the loss of income, and also because at the same time, some of their children had become sick and had to be hospitalized. The areas affected by Typhoon Rai were also historical hotspots of trafficking. That's why it's important to overlay the map of trafficking with the affected areas for international NGOs and governments to particularly target them for immediate assistance. So I'll go to our interventions after a while. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jean. Beatrice, would you like to present? You're on mute.
Okay, what I could say about Haiti is that since the past 30 years that I've been back after university, Haiti has been always in a disaster situation or just out to be in another one. I can say that natural disasters, we had at least 5 major ones, not to say that we had small ones, because sometimes just rain is already a natural disaster. Okay, we had to fight 5 pandemics between HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, cholera, and COVID. And in between all this, we systematically have man-made disaster, like embargo, coup d'etat, election that finish into riots. And at this moment, since I can say that since 2018, we are in some kind of lockdowns because of street violence, gang violence, kidnappings. And so women, what I have lived, what I have seen is that what I've learned is that women is most of the time the first to be impacted, not only because of what they go through on for themselves, but because they are the caregivers, they are the caretakers. And so very often they have to manage also what's happening to others. And something else that I can say, women, when they are victims of violence, they are blamed. They are blamed by their environment. They are blamed by their family, and they still have to protect the ego of their father, the ego of their partner, especially when it's sexual violence. And women are victims inside their home. They are victims outside their home, and because of they are the caregivers, very often they have to accept unaccepted situation, like how would I say, prostitutions, or accepting to be subjected to all sorts of humiliation just to have access to water, to have access to food, to take care of their small children. And sometimes they have to ask and most of the time they ask the daughters, not the sons, to go and look for water, go and look for food to bring to the family. So how would I say, for the COVID situation, what I could say is that really the population had a lot of lessons learned from cholera. For example, the washing hands and distancing from other people. But I have to say that it was not as well managed as other places. But at the same time, how would I say, very often I see they talk about there was more domestic violence because of lockdowns, but I can say that in Haiti we had not observed this because anyway we are first already in lockdowns, and the domestic violence is always present. And for example, the situation of kidnappings that we are living at this moment, men are being kidnapped as well as women, but most of the time women are victims of rape when they are being kidnapped, where men, it does happen that some men have been raped, but not at the same level or at the same rhythm, I would say, than women. Okay. And well, for now, that would be it. And because one thing really is that when they talk about the resilience of the Haitian population, the resilience really comes from the women, I would say. but we're gonna talk about it later.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Your turn.
Okay, and hi. So in New Orleans, when the pandemic hit, we were still actually recovering from Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Gustav, and during the pandemic, Hurricane Ida, that hit and damaged major infrastructure throughout the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is a hospitality-driven city, and more than half of the population rely on this industry for their income. COVID-19 impacted that industry, therefore it displaced thousands of people from employment. And with the mandated citywide quarantines, as the positivity rates for COVID fluctuated, it's created an atmosphere here of isolation, despair, and economic hardship. Due to the necessary quarantines and the economic impact of natural disasters such as COVID-19, and most recently Hurricane Ida, which caused millions of dollars of damage throughout the city and left many families homeless and without power and food, we've seen a significant and dangerous increase in gender-based violence against women. The economic hardship has created a vulnerability for girls and women to be recruited into the sex trade more easily. Domestic violence has dramatically increased from quarantine and economy stressors, and reports of sexual assaults have sharply increased. These women that are experiencing the violence, they've been forced, whether due to finances, fear, finding safe housing, and other systemic barriers. They've stayed longer with their abusers, exploiters, traffickers, and they've reported they were unable to seek long-term assistance, since some of these resources that we have within the city are still operated on a virtual level, or they've closed down permanently due to the lack of funding. The young girls and women seeking our assistance have shared their stories of horrific abuse. We've heard of an increase in even the frequency of the abuse by their abusers, and genuine fear that they would die at the hands of their abusers. These girls and women seeking the refuge to end the violence against them, they continue to face challenges with lack of safe and affordable housing or shelter, and lack of continuum of care to sustain independent living without these abusers. This has left many women vulnerable, especially Brown and Black women and trans women vulnerable to being exploited into the sex trade. And we see the amount of violence they're enduring. And it's hard when you have a city's infrastructure that has somewhat shut down, not fully recovered because of natural disasters like COVID and hurricanes. And it makes it very hard for these young women to seek resources that can lead them out of that trade.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, so
Sheri.
important. So before I give you the floor, Genoveva, I see that Jean has joined us. Welcome, Jean. We started the panel discussion, but we look forward to your opening comments. So welcome from Egypt. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor
Hi,
is
Taina, and hi, everyone. Thank you so very much, and my pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened, but I think some timing got mixed up here. And colleagues and friends, good wishes from Cairo, and a very big thank you to the Sanctuaries for Women and the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women for inviting me to make these opening remarks on behalf of UN Women on violence against women, including women migrant workers in the context of climate change and extreme weather events. Well, to begin with, in 2020, there were about 31 million people displaced within their own countries, half of these women suffering the disproportionate impacts of climate change and extreme weather events, including violence against them. And about 90% of these people were really from the worst affected countries with the least capacity to adapt. And so really, our fight against climate change is not just to make the planet livable, but also for the majority of women and girls, it is a struggle against all forms of discrimination against women and girls in the context of climate change, including violence against them. Well, all of us, I need hardly say, are aware that violence against women and girls is an assertion of male power in interaction with a whole host of other forms of power against them in normal times. And this is aggravated and triggered in the context of climate change and extreme weather events in a whole range of circumstances, taking advantage of women's heightened vulnerability and their despair. So what exactly are these circumstances? Well, number one, sexual violence when women and girls traverse longer distances and more hazardous routes in search of food, water, fuel, etc. Two, sexual bribery and transactional sex in the context of scarcer food or the inability to access relief items, reconstruction resources. Three, physical violence against older women, against women with disabilities, illnesses, persons of different sexual orientations and gender identities, for example, and violent appropriation of their assets, including their relief reconstruction resources, oftentimes leaving them to perish in disaster sites for a whole variety of reasons. Fourthly, all kinds of violence, including economic violence against women migrant workers at all stages of migration. And these women are migrating away from slow onset disasters. Sexual violence against women who are evacuating, girls who are evacuating in the context of a decline, a disintegration of traditional family systems or separation from family. Sexual violence and other forms of violence against women in women-unfriendly shelters and camps that are overcrowded, congested with common baths and toilets at a distance from where women stay, that are poorly secured, that are underlit and poorly resourced. An increase in domestic violence as men have their masculinities threatened in the context of overall impoverishment. A rise in trafficking for sexual exploitation, for forced labor, for different kinds of criminal activity, taking advantage of women's vulnerability. And then further, an increase in early labor, in early marriage, forced marriage as a cost-cutting device, one more mouth less to feed, so to speak. And so we are seeing prevention efforts are greatly lacking, and a vast majority of women really have a lack of access to services and to access to justice. What might be the reasons for this? Many of them we all know. But low-skilled migrant workers, for instance, are often excluded from violence against women laws because these laws govern only citizens. And particularly in countries where migrant workers, particularly low-skilled migrant workers, are seen as guests or are seen as temporary contract workers. Oftentimes, the provisions of EVA laws contradict migration laws. Or for instance, undocumented migrant workers do not have access to resources, to services. And they're afraid of approaching authorities, as we know, because they're afraid of getting identified, arrested, detained, and deported. Thirdly, migrant workers moving across countries and violated by a whole string of perpetrators across countries often cannot identify or have difficulties in identifying these perpetrators and bringing them to book. Fourthly, stigma, lack of knowledge, not knowing who to report to, how to report, a fear and distrust of justice systems and their outcomes, a fear of reprisals from perpetrators, a lack of resources that women have, or unfriendly police and justice infrastructures preempt women's access to justice. But we also know that in some contexts, documented women migrant workers do have access to the law or are covered by the law, do have access to resources. However, gender, nationality, ethnic, racial biases come into play. And oftentimes there are regulations and immigration laws that are at contradiction and variance with other laws. For instance, you cannot hold a job or continue working when bringing a case to trial in some contexts. Or for instance, the moment you stop working, you lose your residency permit. And and therefore you cannot pursue your case. Humanitarian plans of action and strategies are often gender blind because of a lack of conceptual and operational capacities, awareness on gender equality and women's rights, and are very, very poorly financed. And lastly, in the context of large-scale displacement and movement, our resources are so strained, and this also points to some extent to poor planning. But finally, what I do want to say is that women are not just victims. They are also survivors, they are subjects, they are agents, they are first-line responders in climate change and extreme weather events, and they bring their local knowledge, perspectives, their skills, including their leadership style, their networks, their social skills to bear on the situation and to move beyond it. So what do we need to do? In the final analysis, number one, from our experience, we see the need to undertake needs assessments, violence and other issue-related needs assessments of different categories of women in climate change and disasters. Two, a reform of laws, EVA laws and all other related laws and strategies that ensure harmony between these different laws, that address the priorities of different categories of women and ensure a comprehensive package of eval services. Thirdly, we really need to enhance the capacities, the conceptual and application capacities of our legislators, of our law enforcers, interpreters, service providers, to design and to implement these laws and strategies in women's interests. And we need women leaders and women who are affected by violence, by climate change, by disasters, to be represented in adequate measure on these decision-making mechanisms at all stages of the policy process. We need to invest in large-scale, in scalable, institutionalized interventions that promote socio-economic access to socio-economic services, to legal services, to gender-just police, a justice infrastructure at national level, local, and at community levels. We need to invest in large, scalable interventions, institutionalized interventions on social norm change, work with men and boys to advance the gender agenda. And finally, we really need to ensure gender-responsive budgeting in order that women's priorities with respect to violence and a whole range of other issues are addressed both in normal times and in the context of climate change and extreme weather events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean, for your powerful remarks. We're thrilled that you were able to join us, and we thank you for your valuable contributions. Now I have the honor to introduce two of my colleagues from Sanctuary for Families, Sarah Hayes, who is the Deputy Director of Sanctuary's Economic Empowerment Program, and Sonia Mansoor, who is Sanctuaries for Families Senior Manager for Public Benefits Legal Advocacy. So I want to ask you both, the spike in domestic violence that has taken place since COVID-19 hit has been described as a shadow pandemic. Given that both of you are experts working at one of New York's largest service providers for survivors of domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence, I want to ask you, and I want to start with Sarah, how has COVID-19 impacted women and girls across New York City, and how has this affected the work that you do at Sanctuary for Families?
Thanks so much, Genoveva. Glad to be here this evening. I think what we've seen is a real deepening and layered and dynamic experience of isolation. If survivors were isolated and felt alone in their suffering before, when the pandemic hit, it was just really phenomenal, because I mean, all of the lifelines that people had quickly kind of just poofed and went away. It definitely highlighted, further highlighted all the existing vulnerabilities and the gaps in resources, lack of resources that existed pre-pandemic for women all over the country, very much so in New York as well. And for those who were economically unstable or experiencing financial abuse, the experience of now not being able to just walk into wherever you could get those services that you would have had access to before was really staggering. So for those individuals who, had access to resources, could just adjust to the new, they could work remotely, they could educate themselves remotely, they could train remotely. They had a different experience than those that were essentially now like further and more deeply trapped in their experiences of trauma and abuse. And they were, relatedly further stymied in their pursuit of trying to pull themselves out and away from that abuse that they suffer. I think, mothers were especially impacted, especially those who suffer with economic instability, because whatever remedies they had to childcare before the pandemic, that they had cobbled together, now disappeared overnight, making it additionally harder for them to secure any job, let alone a job that would actually allow them to support their families and themselves, independent of an abuser. And I think that really did, deeply impact how we thought about delivery of service in the economic empowerment program at Sanctuary for Families, because we saw that the biggest hurdle to delivering our services around economic empowerment and training and career readiness and digital literacy was that clients just did not have access to the technology that they needed to do a remote program. But we knew that what we were offering could really meaningfully impact our clients' fit, right? And the likelihood of them being hired, even in a COVID, workplace, right? So we shifted how we do everything. We at first started off hand delivering materials to clients, laptops, Wi-Fi access if they didn't have it. And we moved all of our training to digital delivery via Zoom. And what we've seen is that, with, a little ingenuity, creativity, and dedication to reaching survivors wherever they are, the clients kind of came to us and they were ready to soak up the training and soak up the skills. And at the end of the training, they end up being super certified, and to employers, they look like amazing fits for the types of jobs that they're looking to fill now. And we've had some of our best placement numbers during a time where the job market would have seemed most inhospitable, right? But our clients came out especially prepared because we focused on bridging that digital divide for them at a time where they were most isolated.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Sonia, now let's go with you. I want to ask you, how have natural disasters like Hurricane Sandy or the COVID-19 pandemic itself affected survivors' ability to access public benefits in New York City?
Thank you, Genoveva, for the question. So talking about survivors during the COVID-19 pandemic and after Hurricane Sandy, they had a very hard time navigating systems. When applying for government benefits like unemployment and public benefits, many survivors lost their food during Hurricane Sandy. The food was spoiled due to power outages, or they lost their homes. And they faced major insecurity. So Sanctuary stepped in and provided access to information for replacing food stamps. Food stamps is a federal benefit for low-income individuals. And we also assisted survivors with obtaining replacement food stamps. So the survivors actually faced many obstacles to obtaining replacement food stamps as well. There was a 10-day limit to filing the food stamp replacements. And if you hadn't filed it in time, then you were out of luck. And also only 50% of the food stamps were replaced. So, there was food shortage as well. In terms of accessing public benefits during the pandemic, again, it was very hard for the survivors. Most of the welfare job centers that provide public benefits shut down. And usually we have many job centers per borough, but there was only one job center open per borough during that time. And so that meant that survivors just couldn't walk in and apply for benefits. So applications basically went online. Survivors didn't even know job centers had shut down. Some still don't know that they have shut down. A lot of them have reopened now, but this is I think in the first year, most of the job centers had shut down. And basically you were not required to come to a welfare job center to apply for benefits. However, applying for benefits online was kind of another kind of world altogether. So there were lots of barriers in accessing benefits for clients, and so the first barrier is, of course, the language barrier, because if you're an immigrant survivor and you do not read or write English or are limited English proficient, well, then you really can't navigate an application online. Otherwise, you could have walked into a center and maybe asked for an interpreter. That is obviously not available at your home, right? So major barrier in applying. Also, not all survivors are tech savvy. So you actually needed to complete the application online, and then you had to submit supporting documentation on a smartphone. And not all survivors had a smartphone. And what that meant was that we at Sanctuary were at the forefront of handling applications and renewals. We had our phones ringing off the hook because even if clients had smartphones, they were not tech savvy, or they didn't have smartphones. They didn't have computers, they didn't have iPads. So it was a very difficult time to get people on benefits, get survivors on benefits. The other thing I wanted to mention was loss of housing during Hurricane Sandy. So, there was a lot of devastation, a lot of flooding, and basically Sanctuary helped survivors obtain FEMA vouchers for hotels for temporary housing at that time. We also helped survivors in obtaining grants to restart their small businesses. Just a second. And just in terms of Sanctuary clients, a lot of them that were working in the service industry during the pandemic, they lost their jobs. A lot of our clients lost their jobs, but especially those in the, in the service industry, like our clients who are home health aides or, who, were domestic workers, a lot of them lost their jobs. And that meant, losing their income. And once they had lost their income, they accumulated a bunch of rent arrears. So I have like clients who owed like over a year's worth of rent arrears, like ranging from $5,000 to $30,000. I have never seen rent arrears like that ever. And I've worked at Sanctuary for almost 20 years. It was just huge amounts of rent arrears, and clients were afraid of being homeless, of facing eviction. So again, Sanctuary kind of, came to the rescue. We helped survivors apply for one-shot deal applications. They are basically emergency grants in New York City. It's a kind of public benefit. And again, these are made available online. And again, it was the same issues. You needed a smartphone, you needed to know technology, you needed to have access online. And again, we were helping clients and gender-based violence survivors in applying for these emergency grants to basically not lose their housing and get their rent arrears paid off. Sanctuary also assisted survivors in filing eviction rental assistance program applications. This was a benefit available to New Yorkers, and it was a huge help to those who did end up filing in time. We have officially run out of money on that program, even though it continues to stay open. But we did help a lot of survivors, again, with like arrears, some up to $30,000 to pay off their rent arrears. And then talking about unemployment during Hurricane Sandy and COVID-19, I think Jean DeCuna touched upon this, or maybe some of the other panelists, but lack of childcare is such a huge barrier in kind of, retaining your job and, or getting a job, or, losing a job. And basically, while our clients, these survivors, are actually eligible for childcare reimbursement through the government benefits, as long as they're working at their place of employment before the pandemic, they could get reimbursed for childcare. But once the pandemic hit and they were working from home, that was no longer available to them. They're like, you're working from home, that doesn't really count as work. You can't get childcare reimbursement. So what happened, as women are traditional kind of bearers of care responsibilities, they couldn't survive working from home and taking care of the children at the same time. So they lost their jobs, or they were unduly burdened. And this led to more unemployment, and more unemployment meant that there was more financial abuse of the survivors during the pandemic. And in terms of unemployment, there were really long wait times over the phone with the Department of Labor. Some people had to wait, days and weeks before they could even get through. And a lot of our immigrant survivors didn't even know the eligibility for unemployment benefits. And just one quick thing, last thing I wanted to mention was that there were federal economic stimulus checks that were given out during the pandemic. However, these federal stimulus checks were stolen. They were intercepted and stolen by a lot of abusers. So a lot of our immigrant survivors, or just our survivors of gender-based violence, they never received their federal stimulus checks. First of all, they didn't even know how to obtain these stimulus checks. They didn't know if they had to file their taxes. They didn't know how they could get these checks. And when they were stolen, they didn't know what to do. So again, like Sanctuary was there to help them navigate this process. We refer them for like filing their taxes. We help them kind of write to IRS and ask for their stimulus checks to be kind of reissued to them. So yeah, just wanted to mention some of the barriers that our clients faced during the pandemic and Hurricane Sandy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you, everyone, Jean DeCuna as well. What was striking during your presentations is we're talking a lot about environmental, economic, climate change crises that foster vulnerabilities across the board, across populations, global North, global South. But yet, when it comes to women and girls, there's that compounded vulnerability to violence, to sexual exploitation. If you had a magic wand, I mean, when we do talk about, within the context of the CSW66 concerns around environmental disasters in women, what is not clear is how the violence that women face on a daily basis is even more debilitating and creates even more challenges. So I guess my follow-up questions to each of you, including Jean, is how much harder is your work as direct service providers within the COVID-19 and the climate crises, et cetera? How much harder is it to assist survivors, to receive resources? And I digress, but it was interesting to see sort of the disparity of the services and resources that places like Covenant House in Louisiana or Sanctuary for Families in New York has vis-a-vis what you would face, Jean, or you, Beatrice, in Haiti, or what you're facing in Egypt with your grantees, Jean. So this is a question for each of you. If you had a magic wand, what would be the one vulnerability? And again, we all have vulnerabilities. We're talking about the exploitation of those vulnerabilities, right? That is the crux of it. So yes, women are agents of change, but they can't do it on their own. So Jean, would you like to start? And then I know everybody has different faces on their screens, but Jean, Beatrice, Jean DeCuna, Sarah, Sheri, Sonia.
It's hard to name one because everything is so interrelated and everything moves together. But I think there is such a serious shortage of financial resources if we were to respond, or, so response as well as longer term development requires vision, capacities, and financial resources to help survivors. And that's where I would put emphasis.
Taina, if I may, sorry, there's not just one wish that I would make, but, and before I make that, let me answer your first question about the obstacles we are facing right now, and especially under the pandemic, coupled with disasters, with climate crisis related disasters. First of which would be the difficulty of reporting. So in this slide, you will see the very stark difference in the number of reporting from the hospitals. These are reports from the hospitals, women and children protection units. We have made headways in terms of institutions for reporting, such as in hospitals, violence against women desks in villages. But you can see that in March, before the lockdown, we had 627 reports, and it became 108 after the lockdown in April of 2020. So among challenges would be also village authorities who have been mandated to respond to all forms of violence against women, delaying the release of protection orders, which is also within our law, that in the face of domestic violence, they should be issuing protection orders, and police women's desks deferring action to post lockdowns, even in cases of rape. The inability of survivors to file complaints with prosecutors' offices because there's no officer to receive complaints. Of course, the most obvious one, and already mentioned, absence of transportation. So it's very difficult for survivors fleeing their abusive partners, and the difficulty in obtaining, other than medical legal examination, all other services. Also, predators took advantage of the poverty that resulted from the loss of income. There's direct enticement or hiring for prostitution or pornography online. There's also the use of the term work, which entices young women towards the sex industry, which is very, very dangerous, the use of that term. And of course, all forms of technology platforms have been used to entice young women, especially towards the sex industry. Pre-existing problems and has been aggravated during crisis or emergency situations are the lack of awareness of authorities on the laws despite the legal mandate, the lack of gender sensitivity, rights-based, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed approach to victims and cases, the continuing stigmatization by public officials, even that our president has been encouraging violence, the lack of economic alternatives for victims as well. So what have we done? We developed the digital modules for local authorities on rights-based responses to violence against women. But in many places, the access to Wi-Fi is uneven. So we continued teletrainings, however difficult it is, because Zoom wouldn't work for many, on survivor-centered response. And we also distributed information. We have stickers on alcohol. We have posters saying that violence against women desks are functional and they should be responding to them. But at the government level, we had to push the Department of Interior and local government to issue an advisory that violence against women desks are active at the village level. We also produce this mobile application for reporting of trafficking and other forms of violence against women, and that's called Her Voice. So we also issued notifications on survivor-centered response, statements of healing that survivors should hear. We also formed an online survivor support group. And so we advertised this on social media that if they have experienced sexual and other forms of violence through communications technology, we have a support group of 30 survivor leaders. So what we have been doing, like psychological first aid and comprehensive empowerment physically before transferred online. As a result of this support, we were able to document 957 cases of online sex trafficking from June 2021 to present. And all of these are women and children. 70% are aged 15 to 24. It's important to underscore that of this number, 80% are adults. I'm emphasizing this because a lot of interventions nationally and internationally are for online sexual exploitation of children, but adult women are similarly harmed by online sexual exploitation and abuse. So here in the post-typhoon areas in December, our staff have been conducting psychosocial sessions. And we have seen, as we all know, that women have intersecting vulnerabilities from being previously survivors of gender-based violence. Some are suffering from mental health issues, consider themselves, are considered persons with disability. Some are deaf, and also a lesbian woman who has suffered abuse told us of her multiple risks that was aggravated by that typhoon. So those are our psychosocial sessions. It's very important to address the economic vulnerability of the women. So together with survivors groups, we started these community pantries during the lockdown so that together they can collectively provide food for each other and even to the community. So those who did not have any were even able to distribute to others. We also formed gender-based violence watch groups in evacuation camps, and this was even before the lockdown. We train them on self-defense so that they'll be able to hold their spaces within their own bodies and their spaces in communities. And because of that, there's visible, quantifiable decrease in all forms of gender-based violence, including sex trafficking in post-disaster areas. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Phenomenal work. Yes, Beatrice, please.
Yeah, so yesterday I was with a group of women. And so after the therapy sessions, one of them was, listen, Beatrice, all of this is very good. After a session, I always feel good coming to the center. I meet other women, we are together, really, it's good. But what we really need, it's really financial means, because when we are in a situation where we have lost everything, when we have to leave our home, and we end up in the streets with our children, and it's very difficult to get back on our feet and being able to help our children. So and once she was able to say that, most of the other women were like, exactly, we understand, we know we have to get back on our feet, but the financial aspect of the violence, because when a woman is a survivor of rape, she's a survivor of domestic violence, very often she kicked out of the family. She doesn't have the support of her family. And so she has to count on friends, she has to count on strangers that have pity for her. And so when I was listening to Sonia, I was like, whoa, they do have a lot of services that they can provide. But in a place like Haiti, it's really not at all that situation. So if really there would be one magical, it will be to be able to help them financially. And from there, from what they say, they would be able to get back up on their feet and reorganize their life.
I just wanted to chime in and say that, there's been a huge rise in domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence during the pandemic. And things were so bad that we were literally getting almost daily notifications via text from the government and the mayor warning the public about the rise of domestic violence in New York City. So that was, I've never seen anything like that before. Like literally we had notifications coming to our phones. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight was that survivors, have had many issues in obtaining orders of protection and receiving adequate police response to domestic violence incidents during the pandemic. And also different court systems like the family court, housing court, so many different courts shut down or open in very limited capacities. And so the options for domestic violence survivors, so obtaining relief, like getting child support, or other kinds of relief were very limited during the pandemic and continue to do so.
Sheri, did you want to add anything?
I'll say that if I had like a magic wand, it would definitely be to have more safe and affordable housing here. Hurricane Katrina was 17, 18 years ago, and people cannot even afford to pay rent. And the subsidized housing that we have, has year-long waiting lists. And it's created a spike in homeless youth, adults, and it prevents women that are being exploited by traffickers and abusers from being able to leave. We're the only youth shelter in the state of Louisiana, let alone the city of New Orleans. We, during the pandemic, were serving over 200 youth a night. And now that the city has begun to reopen and we can help link some of these youth to employment and stuff, we've seen a slight decrease, and I believe we're at 160 something youth a night that we're serving. So imagine now if you're in an abusive home or you're being forced to be involved in the sex trade, where do you go? Where do you go when there's nowhere to go?
Thank you, Sheri. So Sonia, I want to get back to you. We know that domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence do not discriminate and affect individuals of all socioeconomic statuses. However, there are factors that increase people's vulnerability to experiencing abuse, including poverty, homelessness, food insecurity. So when natural disaster or a pandemic strikes, creating additional barriers to the access of public benefits, how does this loss of access to public benefits affect survivors' ability to escape their abusers?
So I wanted to say that when survivors are faced with extreme food insecurity, they do not want their children to starve, and they will return to abusive relationships. And it's very unfortunate, but it's very hard for survivors to see their children sleeping on empty stomachs. So that is definitely something that, will happen in like a pandemic or in disasters. When there's loss of income, there's loss of unemployment. There's also loss of housing that drives the same behavior. So if if a survivor thinks that they're going to be homeless and they're going to be on the street, it makes them very vulnerable. And again, that, could make them choose returning back to their abusers. And the loss of housing could be due to the disaster. It could also be due to accrual of rent arrears, which could lead to eviction during the pandemic. And for the longest time, we did have a moratorium on eviction. So that definitely was a pretty good measure that helped our survivor clients during the pandemic. So that was a huge help. And then in terms of, losing your job and being unemployed, it makes you more susceptible to financial abuse. So for example, if the survivors were returning to their abusers, they were more susceptible to financial abuse because they were more dependent on their abusers. And so losing their public benefits meant that, they were turning to their abusers for their, basically their sustenance. Also, I think one of the other panelists mentioned that, poverty may coerce women and girls into forced or child marriage or trafficking. And so when there's a lack of economic alternatives, women and girls in abusive relationships have, little choice but to remain with their abusers. And poverty and, desperation may, drive them into, and their families into, passing up their children into child marriage or forced marriage. And also these women and girls become more vulnerable to traffickers and other criminals. Also, women are afraid to report abuse sometimes during the pandemic or during disaster times because, they are afraid that they'll be losing their family's breadwinner. So when they are not very educated or they don't have jobs or they have never gone into the public realm because they've been isolated, their breadwinner might be the abuser and in that or the trafficker. And so basically reporting the abuse basically would weaken the economic position, they think, and so that fear kind of exacerbates the situation and they might not report the, the domestic violence or the gender-based violence. I also wanted to mention that during disaster times, there is, overcrowding. And overcrowding in combination with unemployment can force families to spend more time together than usual. And that can also intensify relationships and it can lead to more violent behavior. I also wanted to mention that Sanctuary for Families did a lot during the pandemic for our survivor clients. We doled out a ton of financial assistance. We have different financial grants. Luckily, we have these resources, so our clients could remain independent of their abusers or they could escape abuse. And I think that was a huge help during this time.
Thank you, Sonia. Sarah, now we go back to you. So in her initial remarks, Sonia mentioned job loss as one of the biggest outcomes of natural disaster, particularly affecting women in the economy. So I want to ask you, how do initiatives like Sanctuary's Economic Empowerment Program help mitigate the long-term impact of disasters like a global pandemic on women in New York City?
Well, I think key to that end is helping women build skills that speak to the types of jobs that are career track, right? So we know that for a long time in workforce development, the focus has been on quick training for individuals who were most in need of support and financial resources that secured them minimum wage jobs that, often paid them enough just for them to not qualify for public assistance, but left them especially vulnerable when things came up like a sick child or an injury. And then, with the way that the job market works in these low wage jobs, no employer was really looking to invest in them. There was very little job security. So, sure, they got a job, but it was not it didn't allow them to sustain themselves, right? So in EEP, we focus on helping clients build, portable, stackable skills that they can take into jobs that will become careers for them, right? It'll allow them access to positions that grow with them. They can build up industry-specific expertise and knowledge and translate that to better jobs at better pay and so on and so forth. And those are the types of jobs that we know that our clients need, because those are the things that are going to provide them the security that comes along with economic stability. And when I think about, mitigating risk, right? I think originally Sanctuary came up with the sense that they had to move into economic empowerment as a service provision because they were considering what kept their clients vulnerable time and time again, right? from abusive situation to abusive situation. And the issue is that when you don't have options, when you don't have choices, when you don't have the ability to apply for a good paying job that can sustain you and your child, you do make decisions that can end up being so dangerous for you and your family because you are picking survival, right? So the career track jobs, you know, we focus on jobs in administration and a number of different career fields, ends up providing clients with options to decide to leave, right? Because they have jobs that allow them to afford housing, right? They can decide to stay away because they have jobs that allow them to afford to feed themselves and their kids, right? So I think, you know, when you're talking about living wage versus minimum wage, the difference is, you know, it could be for our clients about $1,000 a month, which is not insignificant, right? So the choice to focus not just on quickly delivered short-term training, and instead, you know, helping clients build themselves up to like super certified with respect to their digital skills, to engage in career-specific trainings that Sanctuary covers the tuition for, providing them with the opportunity through training to build both the hard and soft skills that employers are looking for in the living wage job market, is like kind of like risk reduction at its peak. And really with the type of work that clients gain access to after the training, it puts them on the path to self-sufficiency in the way that minimum wage jobs just never could.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I mean, what you're talking about it a little bit, what Sanctuary is doing, it's not just risk reduction, but it's also paths toward prevention. So listening to each of you, you're on the front lines. It sounds absolutely overwhelming. It almost feels like it's the industrialization of violence against women and girls, right? And we know that their systems are in place, they're embedded in our culture, they're embedded in our economy. But just for the sake of our audience, if you could each talk about prevention, like what is it that we need to do or that we should do, including garnering the political will of our governments, that will prevent these horrors from happening? Because right now there's almost an expectation that violence against women and girls will occur. So Jean DeCuna, would you like to start since you're the institutional voice here?
Thanks, Taina. I think when you talk about prevention, it's the long haul. And I do think investment and work on social norm change and work with men and boys at all levels, whether it's your national, local governments at community level, is critical. There is need to build the capacities of women in terms of women realizing they are human beings with human rights, knowing what rights are violated at what point by whom, and a conviction that they can individually and collectively struggle to be free from violence and bring their perpetrators to book. And the third thing is strong accountability mechanisms. I think at all levels, there is need to hold perpetrators to account and ensure that systems are in place to enforce this. So these are the three things that I would talk about in terms of prevention, which is a long haul thing.
Yes, thank you. Jean Enriquez, I know you're an architect of the revolution, which is what we need, but until it comes, what are your tools of prevention?
What I will add to Jean DeCuna would be the continuing public education. There can never be too much education. As long as we live under patriarchy inequalities, the need for education is so huge. I'm emphasizing this because a lot of international NGOs have stopped supporting capacity development. But this is much needed. As long as we have this problem, as Jean said, it's normative, and we have to challenge deep-seated ideologies of patriarchy and exploitation. Secondly, I also want to mention that cash for protection, as Beatrice mentioned, livelihood is so important. What really helped us in our work in the ground and also in the as frontliners was to couple our psychosocial sessions with cash for protection, because that prevented their victimization into the sex trade. We were able to capacitate them to be able to take hold of their lives, to shift their minds from dependency to aid towards really taking control over their lives. It's not an overnight process, but somehow we are able to shift paradigms towards really being able to make decisions about their lives, being able to escape their homes, and to be able to start their own sources of income through the cash for protection. So this is very much needed, and this is a call for help from international NGOs. Thank you.
So Beatrice, is there hope to chip at the patriarchal systems in Haiti?
Well, what I would like to say is that very often we protect men, even us. Because when we talk about survivors of rape, we should add survivors of rape. This woman has been raped by a man. Very often we say, oh, this woman is a survivor of rape, but we don't say who raped her. And it's the same thing, women trafficking. Who does the trafficking? You know, and this is one thing that so the education that needs to be done is really educate boys and men. Of course, women also contribute to that patriarchy system, okay? But men need to be educated, boys need to be educated, so there is change. Because we forget to mention, or we choose not to mention, to protect their ego. Men are the one raping, men are the one doing the trafficking, men are the one doing the violence. I'm not saying there's no women, but we can say most of the abuser, most of the aggressor, they are men. So this is where the education needs to be made, because we work with the ladies, we educate them, we empower them, we teach them how to protect themselves. But at the end, what I have realized, a woman become more empowered, the men hit harder. So the education needs to be, we need to start educating our boys and our men so they can behave differently. That's what I would say.
Sheri, is that what you're witnessing also in New Orleans?
Yes, and just like Beatrice has said and Gina said, we have to raise men and teach them how to treat a woman. And we focus a lot on education, but we focus a lot on educating females how not to be hurt, how not to be raped, how not to be put in vulnerable situations. And we don't do enough educating, especially young boys that grow into men, how to treat women with respect, dignity, and equality, right? And so that's where I think a lot more education needs to be put forth. Also in rehabilitation services for some of the men that have been held accountable, maybe through the court system or whatever, but there's no rehabilitation for purchasers or traffickers or sexual assault rapists. There's no rehabilitation for these populations. And so it leaves not only vulnerable clients to be exploited, it leaves those that have already been exploited to be re-exploited. You know, we have to fix the systems that we know historically are broken, like foster care, where kids are left vulnerable. They're in unstable housing, they're coming from abusive homes, they're experiencing a lot of early childhood abuse that often is not addressed, which leaves them extremely vulnerable to falling for some of these tactics that exploiters have. We have to do more of a community centered approach when we're dealing with victims and survivors, where more service providers, NGOs need to collaborate together. We're part of the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force, where we're the lead service provider. And it really is helpful when we're assisting a victim to use that multidisciplinary team approach to offer them more services through a range of agencies that collaborate with us. We have over 70 agencies. And we have been able to prevent one by one on an individual basis. Some youth, vulnerable youth, women that have been exploited, but it needs to be on a much larger scale. And government, politicians, local, state, and national need to get involved. And there need to be a little bit more harsher penalties for people that are doing the exploitation. Consistency in laws and in sentencing.
No, it's definitely a holistic, yes, situation that we need to address. So does Sonia and Sarah, you talked about risk reduction and services, obviously. Does Sanctuary work on prevention? Do you have in your programs preventive mechanisms so you'll have less clients in the future?
So Sanctuary definitely does a lot of prevention work. And it's interesting, you know, I was born and raised in Pakistan. I'm also a Pakistani lawyer. I moved here about 20 years ago. So it's interesting, you know, the work there and work here is similar in certain respects. You know, survivors of gender-based violence, they are so isolated by their abusers, you know, they are kind of relegated to the private, you know, realm and not really, and I see that a lot in our immigrant survivors as well, you know, they are not allowed to come out of their homes and access public systems. So how do you break the silence and how do you get information to them? And I think what is really key and what has been really key, you know, in different parts of the world, whether it was Pakistan or whether it's Sanctuary for Families in New York, is that, you know, it's about community outreach. It's about doing education. It's about going into the temples and the hair salons and, you know, places where, you know, women will, you know, will go to the schools and, you know, talking to them about domestic violence, talking to children about healthy relationships. And Sanctuary does a lot of this work. We do a lot of outreach. We partner a lot with community-based organizations, you know, and we spread the word out there about our services. And, you know, we are very unique in the sense that we really provide a lot of holistic services. We have a shelter, we have clinical program, and, you know, and we have economic empowerment program. And a lot of these community-based organizations, you know, refer clients to us because they need those services. So yeah, we do a lot of prevention work. We even do roll call trainings for police officers. You know, we train health workers, and I'll also let Sarah chime in. Sarah?
Sonia, you covered so much of it, but I think you know, one thing that makes me proud of the work that Sanctuary does is that we are so, you know, dedicated to community education, but also on the individual level, right? You're empowering clients to discover the solutions for themselves that are going to keep themselves safe. And I mean, I have to say, it's amazing how many clients come back to the Economic Empowerment Program as alumni looking for candidates for jobs that they need to fill, right? So you really do feel like you're part of a movement in that sense, because individuals that have been empowered to, you know, reclaim their safety, reclaim their economic stability, are now able to empower others to do that as well. And that's a very, very powerful thing.
You know,
Thank you all.
Taina, if
Sorry,
I may, we've talked about, I mean, we're talking about prevention and we're talking about response and prevention, risk reduction, response and recovery. And I want to pick up on this thing about holistic services for all these different responses as an umbrella term. I mean, we're cutting across various disciplinary fields. We're cutting across various policy fields, and we really need amplified impact. So I want to make the point about us not being an isolated women's group, but bringing in different ministries, government ministries, and government departments at the government level, that have a bearing on violence against women and contexts wherein violence against women takes place. I want to speak to the need to get different kinds of practitioners, the climate practitioners, the disaster practitioners into this conversation. Because I think violence against women in terms of prevention, response, needs to be embedded in a whole range of sectors and a whole range of policy and multidisciplinary fields, doctors, health specialists, etc. And I think that's one key to amplified impact in our work.
No, yes, absolutely. And also including services for women and their families in national budgets and municipal budgets. And that's key, because it always seems like I always say women and girls are the 13th chapter of a 13 chapter book, very much an afterthought. Any concluding remarks? Like, one, we are in very, very, very difficult situations globally, where a lot of us are not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But through your work, I'm sure you do every day. And so just one final sentence from each of you to give us all hope and resolve to move forward. Sonia, you want to start, since you've been doing this for so long?
Sure. I just wanted to make a point about how it is so important to include, survivors' perspective in disaster management. They should participate in decisions concerning their recovery and relief programs. It was very interesting to hear, how the relief supplies were stolen or taken away from them if they were vulnerable, if they had, they were elderly, or they were, disabled, or of a particular orientation, sexual orientation. So that was very key, in having their voice out there. Also, social protection programs that address the underlying drivers for gender-based violence, such as poverty and economic insecurity, could be designed to be gender sensitive. And systems for rapid and effective coordination between disaster management, law enforcement, and health authorities must be defined clearly to prevent gender-based violence and its health consequences.
Beatrice, you want to give us hope from Haiti?
Yes, what I would say, yes, the women, they are victims, but they are also instrumental to bring the families back together after, for example, after an earthquake. They would be the one looking for all the members of the family, make sure that the family get back together, find the first shelters before the responders arrive. So they will be the one also making sure everybody's eating. They will be the one organizing the food. They also will be the one providing natural remedies while we are waiting for other type of services. So yes, the women, they are victims, but they are also instrumental for society, for the community to get back on their feet. So like I was saying in the beginning, when we talk about Haitians' resilience, we could say that really this resilience is the women, they are the driving force behind the resilience of the Haitian community.
Taina, we don't hear you, but if I may go next, very quickly, I just want to follow up what Jean Dicuna mentioned on what else has to be done. Just yesterday, I was meeting with different government agencies so that we will be able to issue a memorandum circular to all levels of government government to ensure that gender responsiveness is integrated precisely, and this is institutionalized through policy, from data collection to accountability, making sure that gender responsiveness, survivor-centeredness is at the core of indicators, and making sure precisely that women are part of all phases from prevention to response, because as we can see here in the Philippines, there's no women representation in the council that responds to the pandemic. So that's very important. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Taina, I think I would like to speak to scale, because we've for long been doing a lot of work, but it's been small scale, scattered, disparate, very good work, but not taken to scale. So we really need large, well-resourced, so here we're speaking to money, institutionalized interventions, whether it is at policy or whether it is at programmatic level, that are really infused by the voices of women leaders, women affected, and communities that have been affected. So that's where I want to see our work going in the long term. And it has all these interventions, economic, social norm change, but all at scale.
Okay. Okay.
Sarah, would you like to make some final remarks?
I think that I'm always struck by how capable every single survivor I've met is. Like, just women and individuals who have been trained to work and function and exist under amazing amounts of pressure, and that really, to Sonia's point, I think success of, with respect to any endeavor has to be informed by survivor voices, and very likely survivor-led, because there's an understanding there of the context that if you're not a survivor, you're not going to get. And I think that also the impact of the experience would drive the scale that Jean is speaking to, drive the importance of the scale that she's speaking to. If we were, if all service providers doing this work were grounded in that context, but also that, given survivors' capacity, there is so much hope in their employability, in their economic success, because they have all of the things that employers need and want, and I'm going to repeat need, to really kind of move forward in progressive ways in our society. And I feel like having enough of them placed in those positions, holding that power, can really shift this movement.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to all our fantastic panelists tonight. I think that if there is a lesson to be learned from all of your contributions, is that the fight for climate justice is also the fight for gender justice. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and to our attendees, we really appreciate your time. It's been great having you all at the Sanctuary for Families and CATW panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Be well, stay safe.